guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating a one-layer scene using the Life is a Circus stamp set by Pink and Main. And I'm going to create my own scene in the background. And this is really simple, guys. Everything looks a lot harder than it actually is. So I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And this is a stitched border die by Lawn Fawn. And I'm just using it to basically trace. And this will be where the ring of the circus is. So basically like the main stage of the circus. I'm also going to be using my grid mat to line up, well, to figure out where the exact center of my card panel is. And I'm just going to put a little dot there with my pencil, and then I'm going to create my little tent. So this will be like the opening of the tent. And then I'm going to bring out that stitched border die again to create my curtain on either side. So I'm going to use the grid mat to make sure that my die is lined up. So I'm using the same line, so like the fourth line over or the fifth line over on the top and the second one down on the bottom. And then I'll flip around or I'll move my die to make sure that I'm using the same lines so that each side of the curtain is exactly the same. Now this is really basic shapes, very, very basic shapes, and you can see most of the time I'm just tracing here. So I'm going to rely on mostly the coloring to give all of this a like dimension. So once I had everything mapped out with my pencil, I'm going to take the stamps within the stamp set and kind of figure out which ones I have room to use and where I want to place them. So I'm just kind of placing those around my card panel to see how I would want them. And then I'll go ahead and stamp those out. I'm using Blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is definitely my favorite Copic safe ink, but pretty much every company makes a Copic safe ink, and if obviously you don't necessarily need to use Copics for this. I just found that that was probably the easiest way to go. You can also do some masking and do ink blending in the background if you don't want to do that much coloring. So I figured I have room for maybe 4 of the little images here, and that will pretty much fill up my card. So I'll go ahead and stamp these down, and I'm stamping right directly over my pencil lines there because I can certainly erase them between these little lines of the stamps, but you will want to make sure that you erase all of your lines before you move on to the coloring, regardless if you're using Copics or watercolor or whatever. Once you have that color down or that pigment down, you're not going to be able to erase your pencil lines. So just keep that in mind before you start your coloring. Once all of my images were stamped out, I'm going to take a Copic Safe pen, and I'm using a EK Success journaling pen. And these are Copic Safe as well. There's a ton of Copic Safe pens out there. I find that these to be pretty much the cheapest, which is the reason why I use them. And I'm just going to go over my lines that I've already created with my pencil. And some of the ones that may not have been the way I wanted them, like this little tent there in the center, I did extend that down a little bit. And then I'm going to add some detail. So I'm going to be adding lines on my little ring here. I guess that's what you'd call it, stage, ring, circus stage, something like that. But I'm just going to be adding lines basically to add stripes. And I'm going to be coloring these different colors, but I want to make sure that I have my lines in there because you would normally see those, you would normally see the lines being I have everything else is outlined. If I usually do a freehand out background, I don't necessarily outline anything in the black. So I went ahead and erased those pencil lines, and we'll move on to the background. So I'm going to start off with the middle of the ring here, and I'm going to start off with my E30, which is my lightest color. And I'm just going over the areas that are going to be the darkest. So the furthest back, so against that ring, the further back it is, the darker it's going to be. I'm also going to create a shadow underneath each of my objects, including that ball that's coming out of that cannon. That would also create a shadow on the ground. So Frankie's here helping me, so you'll see that I have to edit this a little bit here and there because he keeps knocking around the camera and wanting to get right in my face and right in front of the paper because he loves to watch me color. So next I'm going to go in with the E37 and I'm going over those same areas that we had mapped out with the lightest color. And I have this sped up, I think like 4 times at this point, and I'm going to continue with the background at 4 times because it did take me a little bit of time. I'm going to use some flicking motions in the back just to allow me to get a better blend. And I'm going to bring in the E35 and extend those areas out, and you'll see that these blend out really well when you're using a flicking motion. If you were just using straight lines, you may have a little bit of a problem, or you may see those harsher lines. I'm also going to extend these little shadows out underneath my little characters and go in with my E31 and do the same thing. I'm just kind of being careful going around my little characters. Certain ones it doesn't necessarily matter, especially if you're using a lighter color. There's Frankie again. Um, and I can always use my colorless blender if I need to take any of that color out. But for the most part, most of the colors I planned on using for these little characters are going to be much darker than this E31 or E30 anyway, so I'm not really too worried about it. So finally, I'll go back in with that E30 and I'm going to cover up the entire area here, going directly over those shadows that we had created and kind of blend those out a little bit. Next, I'm going to move on to the ring itself, and I'm going to be coloring every other stripe gold and red. I'm starting off with the gold because red tends to bleed, and I don't like to start off with my red for anything. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading on the base of this little ring with my E15, blend that out with the Y26, and you can see that that definitely lightens it up, makes it a more of a gold color rather than a brown. And then finally going in with the Y23 and blending the rest of that out. I'm also going to color this opening of the tent the same color with the same color combinations, just doing a little bit of shading on either side and where the tent part would be hanging over it and where it's kind of behind that ring would also cast a shadow. So next I'm going to be moving on to the curtain in the background, not the droopy curtain, but I guess the wall, maybe you can refer to it as. And I wanted this to be blue, but I didn't want it to be solid blue. So I'm going to create stripes on here too. So I'm going to start with my first blue combination, and I'm just kind of mapping out my stripes. And I'm not using a black outline for this because it's one object. It just has some, I guess, a design to it. So once I have that mapped out, I'm going to be creating shading on the bottom and the top of each of these stripes. So I'm just using a little bit of a flicking motion, but I'm also starting off with a line that goes right along where my shadow begins. This makes the flicking a little bit easier because if you just start flicking, odds are you're probably going to go out of the lines, at least I do. So next we're going to move on to the B16, and I'm just going to extend these flicks out a little bit further on the bottom and the top of each of these stripes. Then move on to the the B14 and do the same thing, flicking that out a little bit further, imagining that those stripes are still there when they're behind an object so they kind of match the length of the flicks that I have on the other stripes. And then finally going back in with the B12 and just filling in the highlight, which is right in the center of those stripes. Now for the remainder part of this background here, wall or curtain, whatever this is, I'm going to also color this blue, but I'm going to use a different blue combination. This time I'm going right in with my darkest color because I don't want any bleeding. I want there to be a clear difference between the two blue combinations that I'm using. And this combination is so similar to itself. One color, like the B05 and the B04, is so similar that if I lay out too much color, it's just going to look like one big blob. It's not going to have any contrast at all. But I'm doing the same thing using my flicking motions from the top and the bottom, just reserving that highlight for the B00 right there in the center. You can definitely see the difference between the two blues, but it doesn't take away from anything else. It's subtle enough where it doesn't take away from anything else. So next I'm going to move on to my red combinations, and this will be the same red combination that I use throughout the entire card, starting off with this little stripes on the ring of my circus stage here, coloring them in completely with my lightest color and then doing my shading the same way as I did with my gold stripes there, just putting a teeny tiny bit of the R89 on the bottom. This is a super, super dark red, so it definitely gives you the contrast. So I recommend using that or something similar to get that contrast. Just keep in mind that reds bleed, and once they're down, you're not going to get them up with a colorless blender. So I extended that out with the two midtones, and then I'm going back in with the lightest color, filling that in. Now I'll move on to the curtains. So I'm going to start off again with my lightest color, and I'm just filling in the entire area to get that paper saturated. Then I'm going to take that darkest color, and I'm going to be adding the pleats within the curtain. So I'm adding one line with the shape. You want to make sure that you're going right with the shape of the curtain itself, so they're kind of curved a little bit. Same thing for this middle curtain. Going to take those two midtones. I'm just making those pleats a little bit thicker and a little bit longer each time I go over them. And then once that lightest midtone was down, I'm going to take my lightest color again, and I'm going to fill in the entire area. This way it'll get rid of some of those streaks that we had and also blend those colors out a little bit more. So once my background was all complete, we'll finally move on to the coloring of these little characters. Now I still have this sped up too because this took a little bit of time, but if you guys have watched any of my other videos, you pretty much know how I color these different objects because more than likely I've colored them before or something very similar to them before. Starting off with my go-to skin tone combination for this little guy here, and I'm just putting some shading underneath his hat and underneath his hair and on the bottom part of his little hands. For his hair, you really don't need to do any blending here at all because only a little bit of it is hanging out. But I'm using my E50 markers for his hair and his mustache, just putting shading underneath his hat and on the center part of his mustache. For his hat, I wanted this to appear like a dark gray. So I'm going right in with my darkest color because the cool grays blend so well, putting shading on either side of the hat because this is a rounder object, and also on the base of the hat I'm leaving a little bit of a highlight on the top part of it because that's where the light would be catching. I'm going to extend those areas out with my C5, my C3, and I'm just leaving a very, very small highlight for my C1. You do want to make sure that you maintain that highlight because this will make this appear round. Going to use the same combination for his outfit here, for his pants and his jacket as well as his tie. And I'm just putting shading basically on either side. I'm not really concerned about a light source at all throughout this entire card. I'm just putting shading where it makes most sense for that particular image. I'm also creating a shadow underneath his little collar there and in the center part of the bow tie. But again, just using the same color combination and just leaving a very small area for the highlight color of the C1. I also colored his little shirt that's underneath his jacket just with the C1 to make it appear white. For his shoes, I didn't do any shading at all. I'm just using my C7. I would normally use my black marker, but I have no idea where it is. So I'm using the C7. Same thing for his little microphone. And for the inside of his mouth, I just used the R22. For the band around his hat, I'm going to be using a green combination. Again, just doing my shading on either side because this is a round object. I still want to make sure that my highlight is in the center for this part as well. Now moving on to the little monkey here, I colored him a little bit darker than I normally would, primarily because I didn't want him to blend in with the ground. So I would normally probably use my E30s or my E50s, but I felt like that would blend in too much. So for his little belly and his face, I'm using the same color combination pretty much throughout the entire image, but I'm just making his face and his belly a little bit lighter. So my lightest color for this is my E01, and the lightest color for the rest of his body is the E11, and I'm going out to the E18 for the shadowing for the rest of his body. Just putting a little bit of shading towards the left-hand side, being he's facing towards the right. Also placing a shadow underneath the little hat that he's wearing. Now his body is so teeny tiny that you really don't have to do much shading here. In fact, it can get a little bit confusing as to where to put the shading if you concentrate on it too much. So there are certain areas that I will totally skip the highlight color just because there's not enough room to add all four colors to every part of his little body there. But I did want there to be a little bit of difference between his face and belly and the rest of his body. So once I had that down, I will go ahead and I'm going to, again, color the inside of his mouth with the R22 and C marker, just color his nose in solid. And for the little unicycle that he's riding here, I'm going to be using some grays for this as well. Again, very small, very, very small area. So I'm not really necessarily worried about too much shading, but I do put a little bit of a highlight on the tire, especially just because that would be the thing that would cast most of the shadow or have most of the highlight anyway. For his little hat, going to use the same green combination that I used for that other little guy there, but this time doing most of my shading to the left-hand side, being he is facing towards the right. Also for his little bow tie, I'm going to be using that same blue combination that I used for the background for the wall there. And again, using the same combinations throughout the entire card. For my elephant here, I'm going to be going right in with my darkest color, which is the C7, and that's a super dark color, so you want to use it sparingly. Just putting a little bit of shading underneath his trunk, where his one ear is kind of hanging behind his face, where his other ear casts a little bit of a shadow there, and that is part of the illustration, so just use that as your guide. Also on the one side or the inside of his little legs and underneath the little collar, I guess it would be, whatever that thing is called that he has around his neck. Blending that out with the C5, the C3, and then finally the C1. Normally, I would keep my highlight color minimal. That would be the least amount of color that I would use. But in this case, I don't want him to be overly dark, and my C1 is the lightest cool gray marker that I have. So I'm using most of him is going to be the C1, and the other colors are just strictly used for the shading. Used a little bit of the R20 in the inside of his ears and then blended that out a little bit with that C1 again so it wasn't so bright pink. Now for his little umbrella that he has, I'm going to be coloring this with stripes as well as that little collar thing he's got around his neck. Here's where I realized I forgot to color his other front leg, so I had to go back in with my cool grays for that. Going to use that same green combination on either side of his little collar because this is round, it's around his neck. And for the umbrella, I'm just adding a little bit of shading towards the bottom and where one panel of that umbrella would overlap the other. For the middle one, I'm going to be bringing out a yellow combination and again, keeping these markers out because I'll be using the same combination throughout the rest of the card. For the ball that he's balancing on, I'm going to be using a lot of the different color combinations that I've used here. And because, again, a ball is a round object, that highlight will be right in the center. I'm starting off with the yellow because that's the lightest color and that's the easiest to cover up if I go out of the lines or if I make a mistake. Moving on to that same blue combination and keeping that highlight there in the center for each of these little sections. Now for the little dots, I colored these in green and I probably shouldn't have. I probably should have colored the dots red because now I had to go around it with the red. And that's definitely not easy to do because they bleed a lot and they're really teeny tiny dots. But I was super careful, just using the very tip of my marker to carefully go around those areas, keeping that highlight in the center. In fact, I probably kept a larger highlight for this particular area just because I was too nervous going around these little tiny dots. And it turned out fine. So for this little cannon here, going to start off with my cool gray markers, going to color in the little wheels and the opening of the cannon, and this will appear to be black or dark gray. Just doing a little bit of shading around that wheel with my C7, C5, and C3. Then I'll move on to, again, the same color combinations that I've been using throughout the entire card. For this object, it is still round, but more shading would be towards the bottom than the top. So you'll see that I do a few little flicks from the bottom and maybe just a little bit of a line on the top portion of it, because the highlight would still be in the center, but more towards the top. So I'm going to pretty much do that with all of the color combinations that I used. For this little star, I just put a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side because it's such a tiny area. I did want to have some contrast, but I didn't have enough room to really do any kind of major blending there. So I just kept that highlight off to the left. Moving on to that same blue combination, again, putting a little bit more shading towards the bottom than I do towards the top, but still keeping that highlight in the center to make it appear round. Now you'll see that I'm going directly in with my darkest color a lot of the times when I'm working with a small area, just because I'm trying to avoid any bleeding, because these are really tiny areas. You can see that my blue and my red did bleed a little bit on the top of my little cannon, but we'll fix that in once all of our coloring was done. For the ball or the cannonball, or actually I'm fixing it now. I took my colorless blender and just kind of removed that color. And before I add in my E30 that I used for the ground, I'm going to make sure that colorless blender that we used to remove the remaining color there that kind of bled out is completely dry. If I add the E30 now, I'm just going to continue to move around that red and the blue that had already bled out. So once that was dry, and you'll know that it's dry when the paper is not cold. If the paper is cold, it's still wet. So I took my white gel pen to add a few details to some random objects here. And I first added my white gel pen to this little umbrella, and then I put my hand right in it and kind of smeared that. But I was able to go in fast enough to fix that the best I could. So once my coloring was done, I went ahead and, sorry, I'm moving the camera there. I went ahead and took one of the sentiments from the stamp set, and I was going to put a sentiment strip on here, but I ended up not leaving myself a whole lot of room. So I ended up stamping this right above my little cannon there. I think that's what it's called, cannon. Yeah. So I'm using black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. This gives a really crisp image or crisp impression for sentiments. And my ink pad is pretty juicy there. So it looked like it was kind of globby. So I just tested that on a scrap piece of paper to make sure that it was going to stamp clean. And it did. So finally, I added a little bit of sparkle with a Nuvo sparkle pen to pretty much everything. You'll just want to make sure that your gel pen is completely dry before you do this. But that is it, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.